We are back with more of our conversation with Amal and George Clooney. Look at the way these two look at each other. I can't get over this. The power couple joined us in studio on a very big day for them. It was their 8th wedding anniversary.
For most of his adult life, George Clooney built an entire identity around never getting married again. It was not a private preference. It was practically a public position. He joked about it in interviews. He laughed about it on red carpets. And he built a reputation as the most content bachelor in Hollywood. Then Amal Alamuddin walked into his life, and within a few short years the man, who had spent 2 decades defending his single status, became a husband and a father. Brad Pitt had known George long before any of that happened. He had worked beside him, traveled with him, and watched him operate inside the strange machinery of fame for years. And when people ask what really changed George Clooney, the most honest answer is not a scandal or a secret. It is something quieter and more human. A man who had perfected the art of being like finally had to learn what it meant to be truly known. Brad Pitt and George Clooney did not simply cross paths on a movie set and part ways once the cameras stopped rolling. Their friendship spans more than 2 decades, built through repeated collaboration, shared social circles, and the kind of mutual respect that develops between two men who understand exactly what it costs to live a life this visible. That history matters, because it means Brad's perspective on George is not the perspective of a fan or a journalist piecing together a narrative from a distance. It is the perspective of someone who has sat across from George at dinner tables, worked alongside him for months at a time, and watched his mood shift in ways that never made it into a magazine profile. When people search for the real reason behind George Clooney's marriage, they're usually hoping for a dramatic revelation, some hidden piece of gossip that explains everything in a single sentence. The far more interesting truth is slower, more human, and ultimately more satisfying. It is the story of a man finally running out of reasons to keep everyone at arm's length. Long before Amal, George Clooney had turned being single into something close to an art form. It was never framed as loneliness. It was framed as freedom. He had the motorcycles, the Lake Como villa, the rotating cast of famous friends, and a level of comfort in front of a camera that made single life look less like an absence and more like a choice he was proud of. Brad Pitt understood, better than most, how much work goes into making effortlessness look effortless. The two of them had built a public friendship through the Ocean's 11 films, a franchise that turned their real chemistry into a kind of cinematic shorthand for cool. Audiences saw two of the most recognizable actors in the world trading jokes and looking like they were having more fun than anyone else on set. What audiences did not see was the quieter side of that friendship, the version that exists between two men who have both spent decades being watched, packaged, and turned into a product for public consumption. George's first marriage, to actress Talia Balsam, ended in 1993. After that, he did not simply avoid marriage. He built a philosophy out of avoiding it. He dated well-known women over the following years, including Elisabetta Canales and Stacy Keibler, among others. And each relationship arrived with plenty of tabloid attention and very little permanence. From the outside, it looked like George Clooney simply preferred variety. From the perspective of someone who actually knew him, it looked more like a man who had decided that staying emotionally guarded was safer than risking another ending. Brad Pitt, who has spent his own career under a similarly relentless spotlight, was in a rare position to notice that pattern instead of just enjoying the charm that came with it. The way George met Amal has been told so often that it has taken on the shape of a modern fairy tale, but the basic facts remain simple and well documented. In the summer of 2013, a mutual friend asked if they could bring someone by his home on Lake Como. That someone was Amal Alamuddin, a British-Lebanese barrister with an already accomplished career in international law. George said yes, expecting nothing more than a pleasant afternoon. What followed instead was the beginning of a relationship that would restructure the rest of his life. What made this meeting different from George's previous relationships was not simply the woman herself. Though Amal's resume alone set her apart from most people George had dated. She was not interested in Hollywood, was not impressed by his fame, and had built a career of her own that had nothing to do with his industry. For a man who had spent years being the most interesting person in almost every room he entered, meeting someone who did not need his approval and did not seek his spotlight was disarming in a way that few things in his life had been. Friends who knew George at the time have described a noticeable shift in how he talked about his personal life almost immediately after that meeting. A shift that had little to do with performance and everything to do with genuine surprise at his own feelings. Their relationship developed the way most serious relationships do, through long conversations, shared time, and an increasing sense that this was different from anything either of them had experienced before. Reports from that period describe an extended stretch of emails and phone calls before the two ever went on an official date, a slower build that stood in sharp contrast to the fast-moving, headline-driven romances George had been associated with in the years before. By early 2014, the two were engaged, and the announcement stunned a public that had spent years being told, half jokingly and half seriously, that George Clooney simply was not the marrying kind. For someone like Brad, who had heard George say some version of never again more times than he could count, the engagement was not just surprising. It was a signal that something fundamental had shifted in how George saw his own future. Men who have built a lifestyle around independence rarely surrender that independence for anything less than genuine conviction, and friends who spoke to the press around that time described George as unusually certain, almost uncharacteristically serious, when discussing his plans with Amal. The jokes were still there, because they always were with George, but underneath them was a tone people had not heard from him before. The wedding in Venice in September 2014 was, by any measure, one of the most extravagant celebrity weddings of the decade. Boats moved down the canals carrying famous guests, crowds gathered along the water to catch a glimpse of the couple, and the entire city seemed to briefly transform into the backdrop of a modern fairy tale. It was easy to focus on the spectacle. It was harder, but far more meaningful, to notice what the spectacle was actually built around. A man who had spent decades avoiding commitment finally choosing it in front of the entire world. For those who had known George for years, the wedding read less like a party and more like a milestone in a much longer personal story. He was not simply marrying a woman he loved. He was publicly closing the door on an identity he had spent a very long time cultivating. The bachelor who had made solitude look glamorous was now standing at the center of the most public commitment of his life. Brad Pitt, who understands as well as anyone what it means to have a private milestone become a global media event, likely recognized both sides of that moment. The joy of watching a friend find something real, and the quiet awareness of how much scrutiny that friend was about to live under for the rest of his life. Then, in June 2017, George and Amal welcomed twins, Ella and Alexander. Fatherhood, arriving in his mid-50s, was its own kind of transformation. It was one thing to fall in love and get married. It was something else entirely to reorganize an entire life, built for decades around film sets and travel schedules, into one that revolved around two small children who had no interest in his career or his charm. George has spoken candidly, and often humorously, about how unprepared he felt for the realities of late-in-life fatherhood. Sleepless nights, the sheer physical exhaustion of caring for infant twins, and the strange humility of being outnumbered by two babies who could not be charmed, negotiated with, or won over by a well-timed joke, all became part of his new daily reality. Friends close to him, Brad presumably among them, have described his transition into fatherhood as genuine and unforced. A man visibly trying to be present in a way that had little to do with public image and everything to do with actually showing up. There is a particular kind of humility that comes from realizing that decades of being the most charming person in almost any room means absolutely nothing to a crying infant at 3 in the morning. And by most accounts, George embraced that humility rather than resisting it. Every long relationship eventually moves past the stage of romance and into the far less glamorous stage of logistics. George and Amal's marriage was no exception, even if the version presented to the public rarely included that part of the story. Amal's professional life did not slow down after the wedding. She continued her work as a human rights lawyer, taking on international legal cases, advising on humanitarian issues, and maintaining a public profile that had nothing to do with film premieres or award season. George, meanwhile, remained tied to a career that required him to be in Los Angeles, New York, and various film locations around the world, often for extended stretches of time. Balancing two demanding careers is difficult for any couple. Balancing two demanding, globally scrutinized careers, while also raising twins, adds a layer of pressure that few people ever have to navigate. George has spoken publicly, in a general sense, about trying to build a schedule that keeps the family together as much as possible, choosing projects partly based on filming locations and time commitments rather than simply prestige or paycheck. That kind of adjustment does not happen without real sacrifice, and it does not happen without moments of friction, even in a relationship built on genuine love and respect. George has also mentioned, in various interviews over the years, that he and Amal do not argue often. Taken at face value, that sounds like the description of an unusually peaceful marriage. Taken with a bit more life experience, it can read differently. Two people who come from entirely different professional worlds, different pressures, and different definitions of what a demanding day looks like, do not simply avoid all disagreement by accident. More likely, they have learned how to communicate carefully, how to choose their moments, and how to protect a public image that both of them understand is constantly being watched and interpreted by strangers. There is a particular burden that comes with being seen as the ideal celebrity couple, and George and Amal have carried that burden since the day their engagement was announced. Unlike most newlyweds, they did not get the luxury of figuring out marriage privately, making mistakes quietly, and adjusting course without an audience. Every appearance together was analyzed. Every solo appearance without the other was treated as a potential clue. Every year that passed without public conflict only raised the stakes higher, because the longer a couple is held up as an example of what a good marriage looks like, the more pressure builds around maintaining that image, even in the ordinary moments that have nothing to do with performance at all. Brad Pitt understands this particular kind of pressure on a level that very few people alive can claim to understand. He has spent decades as one half of relationships that were treated less like private partnerships and more like ongoing public narratives, dissected in real time by people who had never met either party involved. That experience would have made him acutely aware of the gap between how a marriage looks from the outside and what actually happens inside it. When two people are constantly reminded that the entire world is watching to see if they succeed or fail, it changes how they behave, even with each other. It can make honest disagreement feel riskier, because both people know that any sign of friction risks becoming a headline rather than staying a private conversation between partners. That does not mean George and Amal's marriage is built on suppression. It more likely means they have had to develop unusually strong communication skills simply to protect the relationship from the pressure surrounding it, learning early on which conversations belong to the two of them and which parts of their life they are willing to share. Part of what makes George and Amal's marriage genuinely unusual, compared to most celebrity pairings, is how different their professional worlds actually are. George's career has always existed within the entertainment industry, a world built on image, performance, and the calculated release of information. Amal's career exists within international law and human rights advocacy, a world built on precision, documentation, and moral seriousness that has nothing to do with box office numbers or award season. Most celebrity marriages involve two people operating within roughly the same industry, which creates a built-in understanding of each other's schedules and pressures. George and Amal do not have that shortcut. Instead, they have had to learn each other's worlds from the outside, which is a far more demanding kind of intimacy than simply dating someone who already understands your career. That difference likely explains part of why George has spoken about deliberately restructuring parts of his career since becoming a husband and father, choosing directing and producing roles over acting jobs that require months away from home is not simply a matter of getting older or slowing down. It reflects a recalibration of priorities that puts family logistics on equal footing with career opportunities, something that George of 15 years earlier would likely not have considered. Amal, for her part, has continued her legal work largely without adjusting it around George's industry, maintaining an identity and a career that exist entirely independent of being married to a famous actor. That kind of independence is rare in celebrity marriages, where one partner's career often quietly absorbs or overshadows the other's. In George and Amal's case, both careers remain fully intact, which requires an ongoing negotiation of time, travel, and attention that most couples never have to manage at this scale. No discussion of George Clooney's personal life feels complete in the eyes of the public without mentioning his long friendship with Julia Roberts. The two have shared the screen multiple times, from Ocean's 11 and Ocean's 12 to Money Monster and, later, Ticket to Paradise. Their on-screen chemistry has always been effortless, built on decades of familiarity rather than performance. And that ease has made audiences endlessly curious about the nature of their off-screen relationship. The truth, as far as anything in Hollywood can be called a simple truth, is that George and Julia represent a specific kind of friendship that becomes rare once someone reaches a certain level of fame. They came up in the industry around the same time. They understand exactly what it feels like to be reduced to a headline, and they share a professional shorthand built from working together repeatedly over more than 2 decades. Julia has spoken warmly about the Clooney family, describing how welcoming George and Amal were to her during the filming of Ticket to Paradise in Australia, a lengthy shoot that kept her away from her own family for an extended period. That detail matters because it complicates the version of the story that tabloids prefer, the one that frames Julia as some sort of outside threat to George's marriage. By all available accounts, Julia's relationship with the Clooneys is a family friendship, not a secret romance, and Amal herself has never suggested otherwise. Still, it is worth acknowledging why the speculation persists. Julia represents a version of George's life that existed before Amal, a version built on ease, familiarity, and the specific comfort of being around someone who knew him back when his biggest responsibility was choosing his next film. That does not make the friendship dangerous. It simply makes it a reminder of who George used to be, which is a very different thing from a threat to who he has become. Brad Pitt's perspective on all of this carries a particular kind of weight, not because he has made detailed public statements about George's marriage, but because of what his own life has taught him about fame, partnership, and public scrutiny. Brad has lived through some of the most heavily covered relationships in modern entertainment history, and he understands better than almost anyone what it feels like to have millions of strangers believe they understand a marriage they have only ever seen through photographs and headlines. Someone with that kind of experience does not need George to explain what changed after Amal entered his life. The shift would have been visible simply through years of friendship. The jokes that used to deflect deeper questions slowly making room for more direct conversations. The schedule that used to prioritize convenience gradually reorganizing itself around a family. The version of George who used to treat every room like a stage learning how to sit quietly at home instead. None of that requires an insider confession to notice. It only requires paying attention over a long enough period of time, which is exactly what a decades-long friendship provides. What someone like Brad would likely recognize is that George's marriage was never really about escaping bachelorhood for its own sake. It was about whether a man who had built his entire public identity around charm and deflection could learn to be genuinely present, day after day, without the performance he had relied on for so long. That is a much harder transition than falling in love, and it is the kind of transition that rarely gets discussed in wedding coverage or magazine profiles. Public fascination with George and Amal's marriage tends to focus on the highlights, the proposal, the Venice wedding, the twins, the joint appearances at galas and film premieres. What gets left out is the far less cinematic reality of what it actually takes to keep a marriage like there's functioning. It takes coordinated calendars across continents. It takes difficult conversations about which projects are worth the time away from home. It takes patience with 2 careers that each carry enormous public weight and very little flexibility. It takes the ordinary, unglamorous work that every long marriage requires, just conducted under a level of visibility that most couples never have to consider. George has increasingly stepped back from certain kinds of high-profile acting work in favor of directing, producing, and philanthropic projects that allow him more control over his schedule and more time at home. That is not typically framed as a romantic gesture, but it may be one of the clearest signs of how much his priorities have shifted since meeting Amal. A man who once built his identity around being unpredictable and endlessly in demand has spent the last decade quietly restructuring his career around predictability and presence, 2 things that matter far more to a family than to a fan base. If there is a real reason behind George Clooney's marriage, in the sense that matters beyond tabloid speculation, it is not a secret revealed by Brad Pitt or anyone else. It is simply the observable arc of a man who spent decades protecting himself with humor and charm, and who eventually met someone who did not require either of those things from him. Amal did not fall for George Clooney, the movie star. She built a relationship with George Clooney, the person, and that distinction forced him to figure out who that person actually was outside of the role he had been playing in public for most of his adult life. Brad Pitt's long friendship with George gives him a rare vantage point on that transformation, not because he has revealed some hidden truth in an interview, but because he has simply watched the change happen in real time, the way old friends do. He has seen George go from a man who joked about never remarrying to a father managing school schedules and family trips. He has seen the same charm that once filled entire rooms redirected toward two children who have no interest in his celebrity status. And he understands from his own experience that the hardest part of any high-profile relationship is not the wedding or the headlines. It is the quiet, daily work of choosing your family over the easier, more familiar version of yourself, again and again, long after the cameras have moved on to someone else's story. It is worth pausing on what it actually means for Brad Pitt to have a genuine perspective on this marriage at all. Hollywood friendships are often assumed to be shallow, built on convenience and professional overlap rather than real closeness. But George and Brad's relationship has outlasted multiple films, multiple decades, and multiple life changes on both sides. They have supported each other through career highs and personal lows, and that kind of longevity tends to produce an honesty that publicists and interviews rarely capture. Friends like that do not need dramatic confessions to understand each other. They notice small things, a change in tone during a phone call, a shift in how someone talks about their weekend plans, the difference between a man performing contentment and a man who has actually found it. That is likely the real value of Brad's viewpoint on George's marriage, not because he holds some secret George has never told anyone else, but because he has had the rare privilege of watching a friend change gradually, over years, rather than reading about it in a single article. He watched George build an identity around avoiding commitment, and he watched that identity slowly give way to something steadier and more grounded. Whatever private conversations the two of them have had over the years remain private, as they should, but the outward evidence of that transformation has been visible to anyone who has followed George's career and public life closely enough to notice the pattern. More than a decade after that first meeting at Lake Como, George and Amal's marriage remains one of the most closely watched relationships in Hollywood, not because it is perfect, but because it represents something the public finds genuinely compelling. Proof that even the most guarded, most independent people can still be changed by the right relationship. George Clooney did not simply get married. He rebuilt his entire understanding of what a meaningful life looks like, trading the freedom of being unaccountable to anyone for the far more demanding and far more rewarding work of being fully present for two specific people who depend on him. Julia Roberts remains a close friend, a reminder of the George who existed before all of this, but not a threat to the George who exists now. Brad Pitt remains one of the people who understood the change from the inside, having watched a friend evolve from a man who made solitude look effortless into a husband and father who had to learn, slowly and imperfectly, how to stop performing and start showing up. And Amal remains, by every available account, the person who made that evolution necessary in the first place, not by changing who George was, but by giving him a reason to finally find out. That, more than any headline or rumor, is the real story behind George Clooney's marriage. Not a scandal, not a secret exposed by an old friend, just the long, ordinary, and quietly difficult process of a man learning how to be known, rather than simply admired, by the people who matter most to him. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.